Um, Hi everybody and welcome. This is the opening plenary panel of the 35th Annual Conference on U.S.-Turkish Relations. We're very excited that you've decided to stay after the break. We have a very distinguished panel here. As you can see, I'm going to turn the floor over to them to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their backgrounds in just a moment. But to give you an overview of what we're trying to do here, we're going to really focus on the upcoming presidential election and the impact of a future administration, whether a Trump or a Clinton presidency is going to have on U.S. foreign policy and the United States role in the internet. I have to keep my head turned this way. The United States role in the international community. In just 8 days, Americans go to the polls, and both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, are predicting. Sorry. I'll just try and talk loudly for right now.
Oh, you can hold it.
Republicans and Democrats have predicted that voter turnout is going to be. Republicans and Democrats have both predicted that voter turnout in this election cycle is going to be unprecedented. There's something like 200 million Americans registered today. This is 50 million more Americans than were registered in 2008, so it's really a big deal. This is also the only panel on this conference program that's not focused exclusively on the U.S.-Turkish bilateral relationship, so we'd like to take advantage of that and keep our conversation as broad and open as possible. I've advised the panelists that I'm going to guide them with questions, but that this is really meant to be interactive and a discussion, and they should feel free to piggyback off of one another and ask each other questions. If we have time at the end of the panel, I'll open it up to audience questions too, but we've only got 45 minutes, so don't know whether that'll happen or not. We are doing this panel today because foreign policy and national security has really been at the forefront of this election cycle since the primaries, all the way through the recent spate of vice presidential and presidential debates. And it's really poised to be a driver of voters at the polls this year. The degree to which Americans are concerned about the threats they face is unprecedented, and the degree to which those threats really vary widely and are spread out across the globe is also unusual. As you know, our two candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, differ sharply on most, if not all, of these issues, everything from combating terrorism to confronting adversaries across the globe to managing the threat of nuclear weapons and mitigating civil wars in countries like Libya and Yemen. So hopefully we'll highlight some of those issues in our conversation for you today. I'd like to just briefly introduce you to our four panelists. We've got Dr. Waleed Fares, who's joining us today. We have got Andrew Bowen, Alicia Sloan, and Elif Dordunju. I'm going to ask each one of them to just spend a minute telling us about themselves. Thank you.
Oh, I can speak it. Thank you, Jillian. Very quickly, I introduce myself and maybe the 3 points I'd like to make, the titles of these 3 points. I am a colleague with Jillian at Fox News, do not represent Fox News here. I am a provost of a university many among you are aware of, which is a Turkish-American university on leave right now. And thirdly, probably most relevant here, I am, until next Tuesday, advisor on foreign affairs for Donald Trump for president. And I'll be very happy to engage with you in the discussion and debate. I would be happy to talk about what would be the highlights of foreign policy if Mr. Trump or when Mr. Trump become a president, and also focusing in a more intense way on the Middle East and Turkey as a core of these relationships. So thank you for inviting me again, and I'll be enjoying the panel.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Jillian. So, does this work? All right, so I'm a fellow at the Wilson Center, and I also write a weekly column for Arab News and Al Arabiya, as well as sit on the counterterrorism working group of the John Hay Initiative. So it's great to be here and have been to Turkey a number of times, and thank you again.
My name is Alicia Sloan. I am the Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of Duco Experts. We are an online platform where former White House officials, national security advisors, and cybersecurity experts and more are online at company's disposal. If you are a company doing business in Turkey or a Turkish company yourself, you can talk to them on demand. My background is I'm a former intelligence officer and Hill staffer, and who had done details on the Pentagon. So looking forward to talking about the foreign policy post-election.
My name is Elif Dördüncü Aydemir. I'm the founder and the president of Quattro Strategies and Consulting based in Istanbul, Turkey, but also operating in other parts of the world. We have been running campaigns all over the world since 2004, but I'm a political scientist specialized on international strategies as well. I'm teaching at Istanbul Bilgi University, Paris Sorbonne University, and George Washington University Global Management Program. So it's a pleasure to be here again.
Thank you to all of you. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into questions. Dr. Ferris, I'll go to you first since you're here kindly representing the Trump campaign this morning, as well as representing your various other capacities. What do you think the first 100 days of a Trump administration would look like when it comes to confronting national security and foreign policy threats? What would the administration's priorities be, and what challenges would he tackle immediately? Would he also seek to reverse any existing policies?
Thank you, Jillian. Yes, absolutely, in the first 100 days. But actually what is more important than the 100 days will be the many days in transition, because this is where most of these policy strategies will be designed. Many things will change, and as you know, you're a great commentator as well, well known in the States. What will happen between now and March, where we'll become effective if he's elected, I'd say end of February, many things could happen. Mosul could have fallen or not, Raqqa would have fallen or not. Things in Libya, situation between Saudi, Yemen, and Iran. So taking this into consideration, from what we can project right now is, number one, I think a President Trump will be addressing the American people in very much of clarity and transparency to change. I mean, he's not going to be abstract anymore. You know, the American public, at least his supporters, believe that he has gone to the level of clarifying as much as he can. So he will be addressing the American public. He will be addressing the Congress. He would work very hard on unifying Congress and the administration on foreign policies, because we need that. We actually don't know how the new Congress is going to look like. But having said that, he will definitely address 3 points. Number one, the whole system of alliances that we're going to have, that we have already. How we're going to deal with these alliances. NATO is one. Our East Asian allies, because he has been making a lot of statements, right? And many of these statements have been discussed. I've been for the last many months dealing with diplomats and international media more than anything else, more than being in the actual campaign, collecting votes. So this will be the first matter he will address. Number two, he's going to definitely, as he said, and I think any president will have to focus on the elimination of ISIS. And it's not going to be only the issue of defeating ISIS. The difference between Mr. Trump and his opponent is that he's going to be looking at what will replace ISIS. Because most of the contention, Jillian, as you know, in Iraq or in Syria are about what is post-ISIS, what we're going to do with the other players, including Russia, the Assad regime, the Kurds, the government in Baghdad, and the Arab coalition. And last but not least, he is going to be re-engaging with the government with whom we had tensions, trying to get to a different point, a better point. And his forte, as we all know, is international economics and finances. So the third major component is going to be a series of meetings with world leaders, should it be organized or one-on-one, to deal with these economic issues.
Great, thank you. Alicia and Elif, I'd like to turn to you two next. Neither of you are here representing the Clinton campaign, but what do you think a President Clinton, Hillary Clinton, would focus on among the foreign policy and national security challenges we're facing during her first 100 days in office? What are the first orders of business she's going to turn to as president?
Sure. You know, I think she is going to obviously be facing many of the issues that are going to be carrying over from the Obama administration, and the largest that are going to be right center stage are the refugee crisis, the civil war in Syria. I think she said that she wants to give a no-fly zone another look. Obviously, Turkey is going to be very critical in negotiating the terms of that. I think either of those are going to be incredibly controversial, though. And I think depending on how much bandwidth she wants to reserve for her domestic agenda, it's going to dictate a little bit about how much she's able to delve into those. The one thing I think she is going for her on those issues, though, is she's a very clear communicator. And that will, I think, serve her well in terms of negotiating with Turkey, but also in setting clear boundaries for the actors, Russia, Syria, and Iran, which she'll need in order to have a successful no-fly zone.
Thank you. Elif, do you want to add anything to that?
Thank you, Jillian. I think the Obama foreign policy of light footprint, which concluded as the retrieval of most of the troops from Middle East and other regions of the world, like Afghanistan and Syria, Iraq, has consequences in the political order of the world, global order. And the most serious one is the lack of the political and military authority in that region, because when the prior administrations have intervened into those areas, they have taken the control of the politics and military and everything. Now they are getting out of the region without leaving any serious political construction behind them. So we see the rising of Russia in the region, also the reorganization of the energy hubs of the world, which is a very serious concern for United States foreign policy, because the main clients of this area are China and India, which are growing. Also, they are nuclear powers. So we are talking about revisiting the nuclear issues. So it will be in the first place in the agenda of the next president of United States, I believe.
Thank you. So two out of the three of my panelists here touched on the issue of the challenges posed by combating ISIS and other prominent terrorist organizations around the world today. Andrew, I want to ask you about when it comes to fighting ISIS and other terrorist organizations, the international community is facing really, how I see it, you can disagree with me, a sort of two-pronged challenge. We've got to fight terrorists on the ground. In the case of ISIS, that's in Iraq and Syria, where they've established their self-proclaimed caliphate. We've got to deny them territory and safe havens there, but at the same time, we've got to try and combat the spread of their ideology, which today is proven to be fairly global. It seems they've found receptive audiences everywhere from North and East Africa to South and Central Asia to Europe and North America. So my question for you is what does the next president's strategy look like? What's the best strategy? Is there a recipe for success as you see it? Or do we have to accept terrorist attacks as sort of the new normal?
So I think one this broad point is going on the previous question. This, as a Republican, though, and this has clarification, I do really think this is Secretary Clinton's moment. I think the Trump campaign is at a point of no return. Frankly, just looking at internal polling that they've shown, and more broadly, what I've seen, it's not coming back. So thinking about Hillary Clinton's strategy, I do think that she is also severely limited in the sense of what her political capital is, that there is a deep moment of populism in the United States, whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's Bernie Sanders, whether it's this attitude of what should America's role be globally. I think the interventionist, internationalist moment is certainly not as much as Hillary probably is more hawkish than Mr. Trump. I think she will be severely constrained. So I think in that sense, looking at going forward on how to combat ISIS, it's a question of what do you do, as Waleed really accurately pointed out, and where I do agree with Donald Trump, is that you really do have to think realistically and seriously about what happens in Libya, what happens in Syria, what happens in Iraq, beyond just saying we're going to defeat ISIS. And I think that is one part of it, is what is the state building strategies of after Raqqa falls? Which ally partners do we use? Which ones, what do we think about Libya? I think this administration has poorly handled Libya. and has also, frankly, poorly handled Syria. So I do think there are certainly those areas where it requires partnerships, and that comes down to our relationship with Turkey, relationship with Saudi Arabia, our relationship with Iran, and then more broadly on countering the broader narrative and ideology. I think, as President George W. Bush, I think rightfully always pointed out, that this is a long struggle, and it is going to be one that is not going to go away, whether it's ISIS, whether it's Al-Qaeda, or with al-Nusra on the resurgence in Syria. These are problems that could be a generational challenge, and the United States needs to be more prepared to think in the long term on that. And so I think in the immediate term, it is addressing immediate challenges, but thinking of the broader architecture, what comes next.
I think that's right of you to point that out, that this is likely to be a generational struggle. It's not something that in the forthcoming administration in 4 years or 8 years is going to be able to solve. Building on that, one of the things that's been a sort of hot button topic during this election cycle, and frankly over the last 16 years, is the projection of American military force abroad, especially in the Middle East. We have, on one hand, Secretary Clinton in the course of this election cycle has committed already to the American voters to not put forward ground troops, any more ground troops, to try and combat ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Donald Trump has not taken that option off the table very deliberately. He's taken sort of great pains to emphasize to people that he doesn't want to really discuss military strategy at all. It's something he wants to focus on once he's in office, and it's something that's going to be kept sort of in closed circles between him and his military advisors. Do you think, Dr. Ferris and anyone else who'd like to weigh in on this point, what do you feel about that? What do you feel is the difference between broadcasting sort of battle plans to your enemies versus presenting the American public with a sort of roadmap forward? How do you think he'll focus on this as president?
Well, let me first say, since the subject has been touched upon, if you wake up today and look at the polls, I agree with your statement. Everything is open. With Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, and others, where the numbers are good for my boss, and everything is at play. So in foreign policy, if we are this week, we'd have interest in looking at both candidates. What would be the policies of both candidates very, very seriously. And these are, I wrote in my social media, these are the 10 most critical days in the decade, what's happening right now. So to answer your question, Jill, you're right. Mr. Trump will deviate from the principle that we've heard from the past two presidents, or maybe more, all the way probably to the end of the Soviet Union, that we announce grand moves. Either we are completely interventionist, we're going to have our forces going and destroying all the terrorists all over the world, or we're not going to meddle anywhere else. But you see, Jillian, that the Obama administration, which basically based its political and strategic philosophy on the two withdrawals from Iraq and Afghanistan, and actually ran twice on that agenda, twice re-intervened. One in Libya. I mean, this is a massive intervention in Libya. It's not a joke. A regime was changed because of NATO led by the United States. And now we are intervening, but in a very soft way, because we're not making it into a political statement. We have thousands of forces in Iraq, as you know. Not just in Baghdad, we have them in Erbil. We have, I don't know how many are there, maybe in the hundreds, in northeastern Syria, operating against ISIS. So, in my view, a Trump administration will be functionalist, meaning if the threat is growing in a way that we need to use our assets, we will. And you and others, especially in this audience, know very well that the next generation of weapons, the next generation of deployment is going to be different from the Normandy landings. I mean, we could project in 72 hours interventions, very specific against a very specific threat anywhere in the world if we want to. But the idea that we're going to be in the business of occupying, that's not what I feel neither the two candidates, but especially Mr. Trump is going to contemplate.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to piggyback off of what Dr. Ferris has said about the projection of American military force in the Middle East?
I mean, I think one thing we can agree on is that it requires strong partnerships. These are not problems that one country can sweep in and solve. And I think that's a point of agreement probably between all of us.
If I can build on the partnership, if you give me a few seconds, since it's an American-Turkish community, and I think the interest here is very intense with regard a Trump administration with regard Turkey. Well, the issue is about in Turkey, where are the crises? I see that there are many areas that would continue to be very stable and grow. Economy, in my view, from what I understand, the Trump administration will engage the Turkish economic world very, very strongly. That's what he does first and best. Second, of course, the strategic alliances with NATO going to continue, going to get better reorganized. Third, where things are to be looked at and need a summit between the next administration and the leadership in Turkey, is what's happening south of Turkey, along that border. This is where everything is changing. So I'd be very happy in listening to what my colleagues here have in mind, but I would say the single most important matter is, will there be a stabilization in the depth of southern borders of Turkey? That's the real question. If he's the administration in the next 90 days, not 100 days, we'll have to make decisions. What is it we're going to do along the borders with Syria, which involves three things. First, we need to talk to the Russians or not. What's our position with regard to Assad? What's our position jointly with the Turks with regard to the militias that exist in the Kurdish area? I mean, these are the real things that I hear about. And of course, the future of Syria. But the future of Syria will only come after we have a series of understandings and coalitions and alliances that now are extremely weak.
Thank you for that. Andrew, piggybacking on that question, talking about Turkey's role in the broader Middle East and how the United States responds to that. The American press has been, this is my opinion, for the most part over the last 2 years, critical of Turkey's role in combating ISIS in Iraq and Syria. The most common refrain I've heard is that the Turkish government did not act fast enough to seal their borders to prevent the flow of foreign fighters into Syria. But the reality that I like to remind people is that Turkey has had to act based upon its own national security interests and is dealing with the terrorist threat in a much more sort of immediate and existential way than the United States, with the threat posed literally at their border. Where do you think this disconnect arises from in terms of the American perception of Turkey, and what can we do as a community of concerned and caring people to try and rectify the public perception?
I do think that there is some truth in the media assessment or the commentary. Certainly, fighting ISIS has been a priority of President Erdogan's government, but has it actually been the top priority? I think it's always been number 2 or 3. So for the United States, and there was hoping that fighting ISIS would be number 1. So I think in that sense, there is some truth to it. I think as well, though, that oftentimes in Washington and some of the media has underestimated is the complexity of challenges Turkey faces, and the challenge of dealing with the PYD and the PKK. That is, for Ankara, probably a more strategic challenge than, frankly, ISIS. So in that regard, I think that has shifted some, but to immediately assume that Turkey should focus exclusively on ISIS and not address the PYD and the PKK is kind of unrealistic. And I think that there has not been a good coverage in the media on understanding the multifaceted nature of Turkey's challenges. But also to recognize right now, kind of in recent months, kind of some of the shift of Turkey's improved relations with Israel, the deepening relations with Iran, also Turkey's dialogue with President Assad over the past few months. So I think in that sense, President Erdogan post the failed coup is kind of rebalancing, is moving to a new position. So I think in that sense, it's a new environment, and the media, I think, at times does not always catch up with that.
Good points, thanks. Elif?
I would certainly agree. Is my voice okay? I think I certainly agree with Dr. Farid that we are re-entering to a period of high diplomacy, especially dissuasion and military diplomacy is gaining importance. And the alliances are shifting as well. As I said, the energy hub is being reorganized, but alliances all over the world are being reformed. And Turkey has now, geographically, its curse and its blessing. The geopolitical situation of Turkey is its curse and its blessing in the region. But also Turkey's mentality and governors' mentality in Turkey is between East, Middle East, and also between West. And our Western alliances, traditional Western alliances, which is European Union attachment and the NATO alliance, also the Western alliances, are being revisited in the country's public opinion. It is a very important moment, I guess, for the US-Turkish relations, because the more we observe in the political area that, especially in two topics, which is the FETÖ organization, which is behind the coup attempt, also the PYD support of United States in Syria, are getting very tense reactions in Turkish public opinion. And the more it stands, the more Turkey's foreign policy is getting nearer to Russian politics or Chinese politics. I mean, it was in the first time of the history of the Turkey that we are discussing getting some missiles from China. We couldn't, and we are now getting some military rapprochement with Russia in the region. So these are creating new wake-up calls for US-Turkish relations as well. And Turkey is dealing with ISIS, also PKK terrorists, and thousands other terrorist organizations in its soil, and it's a present and clear danger for every one of us who lives in Turkey. So we are facing live bombs every day, and we are car explosions. When we open the news, it wasn't like that 5 years ago, 2 years ago. Now, what we hear as first news is how many soldiers we have lost on the southeastern front, and the second news is about how many self-exploding people are caught before exploding themselves on the streets. So we need to normalize relations, the classic anchors with the West, also find new alliances in the region to survive as a unity of the country, entity of the country. So Russia is being very, very opportunist in this situation, as obvious. Now it has an annexation of Crimea, it has Georgian aspirations, and also 3 naval bases in Syria, and the naval float that they have in Middle East, Eastern Mediterranean is very remarkable at the moment. So the only country which is sitting in between those aspirations is a NATO allied Turkey. So the more we get far away from the Western alliances, we get closer to Russia, which must be a very, very important consideration for the next presidency.
I'd like to unspool the Russia thread a little bit and talk for a moment about Turkey's posture and the United States' posture towards Russia, particularly with regard to President Putin's aggressions and provocations that we've seen around the world, everywhere from Eastern Europe to the Middle East, maybe in cyberspace. The Obama administration has tried repeatedly to use negotiating tactics to maximize diplomatic engagement, and at most every turn along the way has been shunted. What should the forthcoming administration's approach be? Should we really try and seek more and closer cooperation with this regime, or do we really need to kind of shore up national defense, be more hawkish and confrontational when it comes to confronting Mr. Putin? Alicia, do you want to take a stab at that first?
Yeah, to make sure this is working. Just moving backwards in time slightly, I think one of the problems with our posture towards Russia has been the communication issue. I think the red line rhetoric that was made and that wasn't enforced actually did a lot of damage in our ability to use this type of hawkish approach in this administration. And so going forward into a Clinton administration or a Trump administration, that the type of communication and messaging we give them, I think, will be critical. I could see President Clinton using both. So for example, with the Iran deal, the approach there is to have very rigorous inspections, as well as using the economy as a way to open them up towards the West. I could not imagine the Clinton administration just using one or the other. I would suspect she would use a hybrid of making very clear communications about what she wants and what she expects in terms of how far they push us in Syria, as well as trying to use the kind of soft power that she's been known for at the State Department.
Dr. Fares, what do you think about the United States' approach to Mr. Putin's provocations around the world? What do you think is the best way to tackle that head on?
Gillian, first of all, what we need to do in the US, whomever is going to be the next president, but certainly if it's Mr. Trump, is to change the narrative and the type of discussions. I mean, we're sitting here as experts and prominent leaders discussing issues, and things have changed in the debate. Today, the younger generations are on social media. If we are not clear enough, they are much clearer. They talk to each other. Americans and Russians and Iranians and Arabs, and everybody is talking to everybody. You know, my son tells me, what are you saying on TV? We know more than that. So the next stage probably is going to be what the Russians have called glasnost, more transparency in the debate. I mean, when we say, for example, we will deal with ISIS. Yeah, but how? Aleppo, what are you going to do? We're going to have better relations with Russia. But Russia is backing the Assad regime, which is basically engaged in battle in Aleppo, as you know, against militias and forces that are backed by Turkey, which is a member of NATO. Hezbollah is in Syria. Iran is in Syria. Iran has a deal with us, $150 billion deal, which we are trying to manage. And Iran has a strategic relation with Russia. So who's going to pressure who? Do we have more leverage on Iran, or Moscow has more leverage on Iran? So I think we had a missed opportunity in the past, maybe 7 years. I mean, under Boris Yeltsin, you know how the issues were. It was Russia reawakening from the Soviet Union. Under the Putin leadership, there were two stages. The one till about the Arab Spring and the one since the Arab Spring. And we feel that very, very, very deeply. We, I think, missed two opportunities, Gillian, in Syria. Both of them were in Syria. When we were in Iraq, the Assad regime was surrounded. We could have provoked the political change because of the deployment. I mean, we were in Iraq, Turkey in the north, Jordan in the south, and the Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean. There were even readiness among the Syrian regime and the opposition, which was mostly political at the time, to try to figure out an exit. Now, once we missed that boat, the Iranians were able to cross into Iraq, into Syria by land. The Pasdaran, Iran Revolutionary Guards, were able to get to Syria and change the landscape of the battle, just because when we withdrew from Iraq, we did not have that ally behind us. I mean, these are realities. Kids knows that. Hezbollah was able to go to Syria, and it was mentioned there was a red line in 2013, and we missed that red line. What was the result of missing the red line? Putin felt, well, I can deploy, and I can deploy strategically. So now, what we have in the region and in Syria is way different than 2011, 2013. That's reality. So when Mr. Trump says, I will have to speak with Putin, it's not that he's in love with Putin, because the Russians are in 3 bases in Syria. The Russians are maneuvering, they're deploying their fleet. So what will be the next stage? Number one, we have now to change the narrative. I think the next administration will have to be very firm in changing the narrative. And being firm does not mean confrontational. Being firm meaning these are our goals, and now what can we do with you? For example, sending a strong message to our allies in NATO. Any NATO border crossed is a problem with us. Now, Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, these are issues we can sit down and talk about. What are the fears of the Russians with regard to ISIS and others? So I think the title that I would propose for the next stage would be to have more clarity. First, in explaining it to our public, what are the real problems, and then to our foes and to our allies.
Thank you. Andrew, so Dr. Fares says we need some clarity in the situation. And another major theme you can pull out of this election cycle has been the competition between Russia and the United States to sort of try and establish a foothold in Syria, looking towards a post-Assad regime, looking towards even a post-ISIS future, and trying to, in a sense, be able to shape the future and influence whichever government comes next, without focusing too much on President Putin's motivations for being there in the first place, how do you think Russia approaches with the latest military intervention in Syria? Do you think this is a longer-term calculation about their strategic national security interests, or do you believe the Putin regime when they say that they're there to fight ISIS as well?
I think it's largely an evolving role. I think that President Putin is not very strategic. He's more pragmatic and tactical. And I think as he's deepened his intervention, Russia is expanding its worldview on what they want to accomplish, how they want to project power. So in that regard, I think that we're certainly seeing a more expansive Russian view in the Middle East than probably, arguably, President Putin initially thought when he had the request from both Tehran and also from President Assad to help shore up the regime as the Iranian offensive was not going as well. So I think in that regard, it's an evolving chess field. I think that after Aleppo, senior Russian officials, senior Syrian officials have said that they're looking at Deir el-Zor, how to reconnect Deir el-Zor with Palmyra potentially, and how do you kind of reconnect after Aleppo falls and start to build a coherent Syrian state. I get the sense that neither Moscow nor Damascus really wants to touch Raqqa at this point, and if Raqqa were to fall, and some of their assessments are the skeptical that either Turkey or the Kurds could ever really come to an agreement on how to govern Raqqa or to clear Raqqa, that it could be an opportunity for President Assad's forces, not so much Iranian forces, but with Russian air support, a potential role in trying to clear Raqqa and further build back the Syrian state. So in that regard, the map is starting to change, and whether it's President Trump or President Clinton, the reality is that either one will have to seriously think about how do we have a dialogue with both Tehran, with Damascus, and with Moscow. It's kind of unrealistic to assume you can only have that dialogue with Amman, Jordan, and Doha, and assume that we can solve Syria anymore. And the longer challenge, I do think that, and I think that Mr. Trump has always raised, which is a critical issue, and some fellow House Republicans have raised, is what do we do with al-Nusra? A huge part of the current opposition. I think we need to be really realistic of what is left in the Syrian opposition. That it is not the Syrian opposition of 2011, 2012. It's a potential national security challenge for the United States, Turkey, and more broadly. So we have to realistically think about that instead of being kind of preoccupied about where we're going to put a non-existent no-fly zone, whether it's in the north or along the Jordanian border. I think we have to start to be realistic on what the map will really be like whether it's after the first 100 days. So,
you mentioned the sort of stakes here that we're facing, and Alicia, you on your opening comments touched on the no-fly zone and the refugee crisis that's stemming from ISIS's establishment of a caliphate inside Syria. So far, the Pentagon has spent upwards of $500 million training and equipping the Free Syrian Army and other rebel soldiers that Andrew mentioned, fighting the Assad regime. So it's really logical to anticipate that our new commander-in-chief is going to consider all options available for protecting them against Russian airstrikes. Military action being sort of like one tool, as we talked about earlier. But another tool here would be something of a no-fly zone, a safe zone that could also serve as a humanitarian corridor to try and prevent the continuing hemorrhaging of refugees, IDPs, and loss of life. Is that something that you think is really viable going forward?
Well, I think fortunately, talking about this now is a little bit different than it was, let's say, a year and a half, 2 years ago. We've seen movement in Jarablus and Dalbeek. That helps a lot. And I think the goal of this, which is very important, is to somehow provide space to empower some of the political oppositionists who thus far have had such difficulty gaining legitimacy on the ground because it's been such a militarized conflict. Obviously, the implementation of the no-fly zone is incredibly risky, incredibly dangerous, and it's something that either president would have to evaluate very seriously. But I think
there is a better chance now for having some sort of space there than there has been in a while because of these movements that we've seen on the ground by Turkey.
Alif, did you want to add anything on
Yes. On the Russian issue, I would like to take a moment, please. The Putin's pragmatism, in my eyes, is not the main motivator of his behaviors. He's a good strategist, in my eyes, a very good one. And he's seeking a new world power position, which they had during the Soviet and the Tsarist period. He's a mix of two motivations. He is not only seeking the Soviet Union area, but also some Tsarist influences are present in his policies. So how West is dealing with Russia's policies in that sense, especially in the Libyan position, it was wrong. And in the Crimean annexation, it was wrong again. Now what we are seeing is the consequences of them. It was, the starting point was the Libyan intervention. And Russia said that day that we will not let this happen again. So we must read how they are acting in Syria regarding to what happened in Libya. Also, the next presidency of the United States will deal with Russia in many areas, not only in the Middle East. The Arctic patrols are an important question. Baltic countries are very much afraid of a Russian invasion, and they feel it very presently in that area. Also, Turkish position is very, very important in that as a NATO country. Also, South China Sea, any disputes with China, United States is facing will come sooner or later involve Russia as well. So nuclear diplomacy, as I said in my first talk, will be in the table in the next coming years. NATO has changed its vice president, and Ms. Marta Goethe-Müller has been assigned as the NATO vice president. She was the top nuclear discusser of United States. So I think it's a very important sign that the next presidency will be dealing about the nuclears and Russia, mainly in all the areas that are involved. But Syria is no exception, and Syria is just one point on the chess game.
I think we're going to have to close in a moment. Do we have time for one more, or No, we don't. Well, I'm sorry. We could probably keep going for the rest of the day, but we don't want to do that to you. But I'd like to just thank my panelists for this discussion.
Thank you.
We hope,
Thank you.
we hope